For the coming hour, we'll talk about marginal propensities to consume. We ran an experiment, and so we're going to show you a number of new results from this paper with Johannes Bohm, who is at Sciences Po, and Etienne Fies from the French Council of Economic Analysis. So to set things up, I'll first tell you about the literature a little bit, because many of you have seen many papers about the marginal propensity to consume, so you might wonder why we want more facts about the marginal propensities to consume. So we're mostly interested in the marginal propensity to consume out of transitory income transfers. So what would be relevant for fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus. And in fact, for this, the gold standard remains these very important studies by Jonathan Parker and co-authors who studied the tax rebates in the US in the 2000s. And so these studies are very important. I teach them in my courses. Many others teach these very important papers, but there are limitations. And let me highlight those to then show you why we think we're going to be able to address those with our setup. So the first limitation is simply that these papers use consumption survey data. So you can't reject small MPCs, and it's very hard to estimate MPC dynamics. You don't have high frequency data. You also don't have enough power to think about heterogeneity in the MPCs by income groups or age groups. The second limitation is that these studies use staggered difference in difference designs. And for those of you who follow the applied econometrics literature, now we have these new difference in difference estimators. And when you apply those to the Parker et al. Setup, you actually find different results. The marginal propensity to consume is actually about half of what it was in the original study, so about 25% of the quarterly frequency rather than 50%. There's some of my work on this, but there's also another team getting to the same conclusion. So given this concern about identification and high frequency, we're going to run an experiment with high frequency data and solve these issues. Of course, there's many other studies that estimate NPCs and don't have these issues. But these studies are not really about the MPC out of transitory income that would be relevant for a stimulus. So we have studies of typical income shocks, how people adjust their consumption in response to unemployment or other shocks. How do people respond in the case of lottery winnings, which might feel quite different from fiscal stimulus. And there are also studies of recurring lump sum payments, like the Alaska Permanent Fund payments. And so our sense is that there is still very important basic question actually to address about what is the value of the MPC out of stimulus-like transfers. So this sets the stage, and let me tell you what we do. So we are going to actually run an experiment where we give 300 euros in the form of prepaid cards to a random sample of French households who are representative of the French population. And we're going to have different types of cards, so several treatment arms, to study the potential role of negative interest rates. So the first type of prepaid card we have is very standard. There's no restriction whatsoever. So it's very similar to a tax rebate. And so we do this with the motivation that I just gave you in the first slide. But then we go beyond that and we think about alternative designs. So we have a card that expires after 3 weeks. We also have a card that has a 10% negative rate each week. So every week at 11:59 p.m., you lose 10% of the remaining balances on the card we give you. And so, of course, the interesting bit is not to study consumption on these gift card, prepaid cards on their own. What's interesting is to have a broad view of consumption. And so the advantage we have is that we can link the respondents to bank data. And the bank works for us. They found a set of people who say they only use this bank account. And so we have an overview of their overall spending at a high frequency. And we can also see rich household covariates, age, income, and so forth. And so we're going to use this setup to study overall spending responses. From the get-go, I'll highlight an important feature about the cards with negative rates. So the one that expires 100% negative rate after 3 weeks, and then the other one. In the end, you should probably not think of those as standard negative rates because it's a small fraction of your consumption that's subject to this negative rate, and you're of course able to substitute and use the card to cover your recurring expenses. And so for example, the card that expires after 3 weeks, in our data, 90% of households do spend 300 euros over the course of 3 weeks. So they could, in principle, just switch. Instead of using their regular card, they use the card we give them. They just don't adjust their behavior at all. And the constraints that we give them should not be binding. They just have to use a different card, and that's it. And so we'll see if it makes a difference or not, despite the fact that it shouldn't be a real hard constraint. So let me preview the results. And we gave the title 5 facts to make sure that everyone is encouraged to remember 5 things about the paper. So the first fact is that the normal card with no expiry date, no negative rate, has a marginal propensity to consume of 22% over the course of 1 month. That's actually quite similar to what you find in the Parker setting with the new difference in difference estimators. Fact number 2 is that the cards with the negative rate or the expiry date have much larger MPC. So in particular, the card with the 3-week expiry date has a monthly MPC of 60%, so almost 3 times as large as the card with no restriction at all. And so the main message is that if you want to increase the MPC, using this type of delivery of transfers might be actually very powerful. And in fact, several countries, mostly in Asia, have used this kind of card or consumption vouchers to very large scale. I'll mention that in the conclusion, but just to say it now, South Korea, Taiwan have, for example, used this kind of approach. And so here we have evidence that this might be quite powerful to increase overall aggregate demand. Fact number 3 is about the dynamics. So I gave you some numbers about MPC over the first month. It turns out that this is all there is. So you have a demand response really in the short run, and then nothing happens. So people spend extra, but really just at the beginning, and then nothing happens. And this is actually quite different from the way standard macro models work. I'll get back to that in one slide. Fact number 4 is heterogeneity by observed household characteristics. To what extent do MPCs vary? Well, actually, we ran regressions by gender. I don't think anyone looked at this before, but that's actually the covariate that we found to be the most powerful. So women have much lower MPCs, in fact, close to 0, after 2 months, while men have much larger MPCs, closer to 50%. That's a very, very large difference that we weren't necessarily expecting. And then we also found meaningful heterogeneity by current income, by proxies for permanent income, like past consumption over the past year. We also find heterogeneity by liquid wealth. More liquid households have lower MPC, but even liquid households who have twice their monthly income in their liquid cash accounts, even these are very liquid households do have large MPCs. So again, this is quite different from the leading macro models that say that really all that matters is liquidity. In fact, many other covariates matter, and you can target certain groups to maximize the MPC. But that said, you're not going to get as far as with 0.2. So the 3-week expiry date really helps move aggregate demand much, much more than what you'd be able to do by targeting certain households. And fact number 5 is that we develop a methodology that I'll get to towards the end to show the overall distribution of MPCs. So when you have an experiment, you have identified very easily the average treatment effect. So you have the average MPC in the treatment group. To get a full distribution at the person level, you need more assumptions, and I'll tell you what we do there when I get there, but we think it's plausible assumptions. And what we'll find here is that you have about 25% of households with relatively small MPCs below 16%, and then 1/4 with much larger MPCs above 34%. So it's a very, what we find is like very dispersed MPCs. It's not the case that you have a small group that has very large MPCs and then another group with very low MPCs. as again would be the case in most standard macro models.
Excuse me,
Yes.
how many cards are there in the sample?
So we have 1,000. We use a few for the pilot. So what I'll show you today is I think 922 cards, and we have a control group of about 300,000 people.
Thank you.
So these are the
question, please.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Do you observe individuals or households?
It's going to be households, but the card is given to a person. So that's why we can do the analysis by gender, because we know the gender of the person we send the card to. But then the outcomes we study are joint accounts or household level dynamics.
Thank you.
Any other question? If not, I'll just briefly mention some of the implications we take from what we found here. The first is that these facts are important for models of consumption to match. And in fact, the fact that we have these pretty large magnitudes, 22% MPC in the first month, and it's really concentrated just in the first month, then it's flat, it's at 0. And the magnitudes remain large even for households with liquid wealth. But that's not quite consistent with the standard workhorse macro models, say heterogeneous agent New Keynesian models, where MPCs are 16% over a quarter, and then they keep increasing to 40% over a year, because in these models, the mechanism are that people have borrowing constraints. Then whenever they hit the constraint and we gave them money earlier on, then they're going to spend this cash on hand. It's not quite what we see in the data. And in fact, our sense is that it's very hard to account for the results we have without some behavioral features. So in particular, we're able to reject standard rational models that treat money as fungible. And the reason is that the card that expires after 3 weeks, for example, as I mentioned, people do spend 300 euros over the course of 3 weeks, typically. So they could just switch. And if they view money as fungible, I gave them this card, it expires, but I could just use it instead of my regular card. And that should make no difference compared to giving them a card that never expires. And yet, we do find a difference. So these results point towards mechanisms like salience or mental accounting. We think that's the important behavioral mechanism at play, rather than other behavioral features like present bias. I said present bias wouldn't explain why the MPC is much larger with a card that expires rather than a card that does not expire, because you'd be present biased in both cases. And the other takeaway from yes, I think there's a question.
Sorry, about the type of expenditures. Can you tell whether it's like durables or non-durables? Because that would affect consumption smoothing.
For sure. So I'll show you that. They spend a little bit more on durables, but not very much more. And over the first 3 months, we don't see any sign of consumption smoothing. So you don't undershoot your usual spending in month 2 or 3. So we find that they spend a little bit more on things like clothing, consumer electronics. So then there might be some of this intertemporal substitution, but it's not very large. And for the most part, they don't seem to be, they're not engaging in massive intertemporal substitution that would show up in the first 3 to 4 months.
Okay, thank you.
So, implications about models I've mentioned, and then implications about policy. Here the message is that if you want to massively increase aggregate demand, you can, using the cards that have an expiry date or the card with negative rate, that seems to work very well. And as always, we can worry about external validity, but we think that it's a promising direction, and you can do it through fiscal policy, but you can also do it through central banks. If you think about, say, central bank digital currency accounts, you could have 300 euros on the account and then say this expires after 3 weeks, and perhaps this would be indeed as powerful as in our experiment. So these previews the main takeaways and the main results. Yes.
Sorry, just one quick question before we proceed. Is, about the cards with negative rates or an expiry date. To what, I mean, I understand they are more effective in stimulating consumption and spending, but to what extent can you really call this MPC? Because to me, it seems that here two separate things are happening. One is giving the cash to these households, and the other is changing the average interest rate that they face on their assets. So even without giving extra money to them, changing the interest rate might induce intertemporal substitution and the consumption response, and we wouldn't think of this as MPC. So how, I'm just thinking whether the two things are confounded or convoluted with each other.
So I think I agree. It's important to think about this. So one way to think about this is just from a very pragmatic policy perspective. We want people to spend money. And so we have two types or three types of ways to do this with the regular card, or the cards with negative rates. How much does this increase overall consumption, measuring substitution on the main accounts of these individuals? And so in that sense, I think it makes sense to compute a number like an MPC and call this MPC. How much more have they spent of the $300 or 300 euros that we give them? Answer number two is that, as I previewed, these negative rates are not really binding. So we're not changing in any reasonable way the average interest rate on people's assets, especially for the card that expires after 3 weeks, because they could just use this card to cover their regular spending, and so then they would not face the constraint at all. And so it's not a binding constraint. If you wrote a model and you say, so you have your regular assets, regular interest rate, and now you have this new thing that expires after 3 weeks, the rational agent that treats money as fungible should not care at all that I put this extra constraint. And so in that sense, I think the extra interest rate is not something that we should interpret as the source of variation to estimate the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, because it's something that you can just perfectly avoid by substituting. So I don't know if that addresses your question.
Yeah. Thanks.
Great.
Clear.
Great. So for the rest of today, what I suggest, and we have about 40 minutes, first I'll tell you a bit more about the data and experimental design, then the main results, and then come back to these ideas about models and some policy implications, also that I've already given you already the gist. So the data is very standard, so I won't spend too much time on it. It's a sample of 300,000 people. It's from a very large bank in France called Crédit Mutuel Alliance Fédérale, broadly representative of the French population. You don't have very, very poor people. You don't have the very, very rich, but overall it's very representative. It's been used by other people, including the French Statistical Institute, to document things like excess savings during the COVID crisis. And so then we build a standard measure of consumption expenditure using these data, these household joint accounts. We see all of their payment cards, and we build our measure of consumption. And then we give to 1,000 people, and then some of those are used for a pilot. So then what I show you today is just 922 participants that were selected at random from the pool of clients of the bank, subject to some standard eligibility criteria. And those guys get the cards. So we had to exclude households who were very young or older, given the bank's concern that these were not good populations to work with. Same thing, we had to exclude financially fragile households. So they have some measures for that. People can't get who are like flagged as not creditworthy by some monetary authorities. And the most important thing is that the bank tells us that they can identify people who only use this bank for their expenditure and do not have current accounts at other banks. So this is not something that we ourselves can check, but they have relationship with the clients through the bank advisors, and so they tell us that this is something that is plausible, that in the sample they don't use current accounts at other banks. I should also mention that this bank is known for having a large number of bank advisors per client, so they try to foster these close relationships between the bank advisor and the client, and that's good for us because it's perhaps somewhat unusual experiment. People could be concerned it's a scam, but this is not an issue that we had. So the bank advisors called the participants, explained the purpose of the experiment, and at the end, we had a survey to see if anyone had issues, and no one said that they were concerned that this was a scam. So we give them different card types. I mentioned this already. The card is very standard. You can do everything you normally do except withdraw cash. You also cannot directly put the money in an investment account. So if you want to save, it's going to be only by covering your recurring expenditure and then doing something else with your money in your main bank account. There's a code pin, the pin code. The pin code is the same as in the main card of the person who received this gift card. So to them, it feels like something that's very legit, comes from their official bank, has the same PIN code, and as I mentioned, did not raise suspicion. And then we have these three types of card. The first card, I said it doesn't have an expiry date. In fact, what happens is that it does expire after 6 months, but at that point, anything that's not spent is moved to the person's main account, and they know that this will happen this way. Card number 2 expires after 3 weeks, and you lose the money that remains on at this point on the card. And then a third type has this 10% negative rate, so we're not allowed by the bank to literally have a 10% negative rate because it was deemed to be too complicated. So instead it's by increments. So what you're told as a participant is that you will lose 30 euros if the remaining balance is above 200 euros on Monday at 11:59 p.m. And then you lose 20 euros if your balance is between 100 and 200 euros, and otherwise you lose 10 euros. So that's the way these things work. And we can run a bunch of randomization tests to check that the participants are indeed randomly selected, and indeed they were, the experimental protocol worked fine the way it should. Now, something that I haven't mentioned so far is that we have an extra layer of experiment treatment arms having to do with framing. So we have an instruction letter where standard letter where people are told that they participate in an experiment and they are free to use the money as they please, but it's meant to study how people respond when we give them money to stimulate the economy. And we don't say more than that. So it's sort of a soft way of introducing the experimental design and the purpose of what we do. And then for the other half of participants, the instruction letter that they receive with the card is much more upfront and tries to encourage them to do 3 things. So 1 is to spend quickly. 2 is to spend on local services or goods made in France. Number 3, we tell them explicitly that they should buy items that they would not have purchased otherwise, because the goal is for them to maximize their overall impact on the French economy through their spending. And we ran some surveys before running the experiment, and people were telling us that if they did receive a letter like this, they would behave differently. This is what people told us ahead of time. And in the French context, there is a history of French finance ministers who have told people that they should buy French. So one of them is Arnaud Montebourg. 10 years ago, he had this campaign about promoting Made in France. You have here a magazine that says Made in France. He believes in it. We tested it. Well, we actually tested it experimentally. And for today, I'll actually just tell you now that we have found no effect. So this thing did not work at all. Telling people in the instruction letter that they should buy French goods, should buy fast, this did not move the needle at all, as opposed to changing the card type. So the timeline of the experiment is as follows. We started this late April of last year, and then people received the cards in early May, and then after 3 weeks, for one of the groups, the card expired. And so this was at a time when interest rates were still very close to 0 in the euro area, and there weren't big concerns about recessions or even inflation. Inflation was just picking up. We're running a second wave of the experiment now with 200 people, and we will see whether the MPCs are different in a macro context that's quite different. But here, this is a context with still very low rates and not huge concerns about recession or inflation. So let me show you now the main results. So first, I'll show you what happens with the whole set of cards lumped together, and then I'll look at card by card, and then things by framing I'll skip today to save time. I told you the framing treatment actually produced nothing. Then we'll talk about heterogeneity. So if you look at the overall spending, so this is a figure that shows you the spending on the prepaid card. So people start spending early May, right when they receive the card, and then this is the cumulative gift card spending. And so you see that after 2 months, they are close to 250 euros. So they've spent 80% of what's on the card. Some people haven't spent yet because they are in group 1 and they know that if they don't spend, the money will come to their account in 6 months. And then others in group 2, but very few actually lost money. It's likewise those with negative rates, some of them lost money. The key question is for us to understand to what extent this is extra spending or if it's acting as a substitute for what people do on their main accounts. And so the simplest way to do this is just to draw a graph of the control group here in blue with the treatment group with the dashed red. Before May, they behave the same. And blue has actually standard errors, but since it's a large group of hundreds of thousands of people, it's very, very small standard errors. Treatment group has an extra burst of spending right after May, but only then. So it's like right at the beginning, they spend extra, and then they're back to trend. So I'm going to show you then other versions of this with in a regression format so that we can think about standard errors and magnitudes more precisely. So standard regression framework. And I can show you here all the coefficients, pre and post the time of treatment, and you see that there's this extra burst of spending right at the beginning. So if we zoom in on the post period to really stare at the magnitudes, you see here, and again, all costs together, that in the first week, they spend 75 euros on top of their usual spending, and then they're down to 25 euros extra. In the second week, and then third week still close to 25 euros, and then after that they're like pretty close to zero. After 5 weeks, if anything, there's actually a negative point estimate here. So maybe slight intertemporal substitution at that point, but for the most part, it's actually very close to zero. You can also plot this as cumulative dynamics just by combining the previous coefficients, and so you see that you get to 125 euros of extra spending after 3 weeks. And then the point estimates fall down actually gradually, although there's also noise, so we can't quite be sure that this is a significant fall, and we're working on trying to see how we can perhaps improve statistical power here. But so if anything, there's a fall back that's gradual, and the whole action is concentrated at the very beginning. So we don't have that much time today, so I'm not going to be able to show you everything we've done, but I wanted to describe something that we have done to try to understand participant spending behavior, which echoes one of the questions about durables. So we've combined 2 approaches to try to understand what people did. One is that we ran a survey in June, and we asked people how they behaved, and they just told us what they thought they did. And then we can also analyze spending categories for the prepaid card itself and for the linked bank accounts. So for this, we have sometimes categories that work very well. So restaurants, we can measure quite well. For things like supermarket expenditure, it's not so informative because people could buy many different things at the supermarket. So from this analysis, the key points we take as our takeaways are as follows. First, actually, almost everyone tells us that they are very much aware that they spent less on their main accounts thanks to the gift card. So they all tell us, yes, I did save more on my main account because I was able to cover running expenditure. And then we ask them, so why did you save? And they tell us that precautionary savings are the main reason to do that, rather than buying something expensive in a couple of months. So this is just survey response. And then in terms of what they spend on, we see both in the survey and in the actual spending data that they primarily use the prepaid card to cover running expenses, so food products, supermarket expenditure. And also there's two categories that they spend a bit more on than usual. So clothing and household equipment, a bit more, have slightly larger expenditure share, but it's not a massive effect. They also spend slightly more on durable goods and imported goods, but these effects are again quite modest in magnitude. So if you don't have questions at this point, let me show you the results that are perhaps the main results about card type. So this is the card number 1, which is the one that's closest to the typical transfer, no strings attached. It will be moved to your main account in 6 months. And so you see that here they spend an extra 40 euros only in the first 2 weeks. That's basically 80 euro extra spending. And then things are basically back to zero and quite flat. And if you look at the prepaid card itself, they actually spend, it's not like they just spend 80 euros, they spend way more than that. But most of this acts as substitution. So they do, in fact, save through the substitution. Now, the card that expires after 3 weeks tells a quite different story. Now they're spending closer to 60, 70 euros in the first week, and then they're at 50 euros week 2, and then week 3. And then after that, they're much closer to zero. But overall, they are at 60% cumulatively in MPC in the first month, while the card 1 was just 22%. So it's a very, very different story. Although in terms of dynamics, it's quite similar. It's still very concentrated in the short run, and we don't seem to see much intertemporal substitution, at least in the following 2 months. Card 3 with the negative rate induces extra spending right at the beginning. In the first week, that's when they spend extra. They want to avoid the negative rate, so they spend a lot that week. And they are at about 140, 130 extra spending in that first week. And then they hover around zero with maybe some one significant negative coefficient here towards the end of June. And so overall, we can compare the dynamics in card 1. So if I combine all the previous week-specific coefficient for spending to have cumulative spending, we see that card 1 increases around like 80 euros after 3-4 weeks. And then if you look at the point estimates, actually it falls back down towards zero if you combine all the point estimates we have. Cards 2 and 3, on the other hand, go up much higher at the beginning, 250, and then remain quite stable throughout the period we studied. So changing the delivery type here had a very, very strong effect in the short run, and then possibly in the longer run, even though we are less powered to speak to that. If you look at things card by card, over the first month, you have this MPC for card 1, slightly under 25%, card 2 is above 60%, and card 3 is in the middle around 36%. So card 3 actually has lower MPC, and we're still trying to figure out why that might be the case. But card 3 is still above card 1. But from this graph, conclude that the simple card that expires after 3 weeks might be the best way to boost aggregate demand. So again, we ran this survey, we analyzed the data to understand what was going on with cards 2 and 3. And so we do see that they're less likely to cover running expenses. They tell us that they're more likely to make purchases that they were planning and that they made those purchases earlier than they would have otherwise. That's what they tell us in the survey. Getting the data, we don't quite see over the following 2 months, we don't quite see a lot of substitution, but in the survey, they tell us that some of this might be going on. Cards 2 and 3 induce a bit more purchases and imports than card 1, but it's a very small difference. So one thing that could be of interest is this idea that we want people to spend fast if we think we are in a situation where aggregate demand would be good from a macro perspective. But you might think maybe for the person it's not so good because we are stressing them out. We ask them to spend quickly. And some colleagues who are on the behavioral side thought that we should check whether there's any evidence for negative externalities. Maybe these people start buying things that are not good for them because they act too quickly. So we've looked at a range of goods that could be viewed as having negative externalities: tobacco, drinking, gambling, and we found no evidence that there's higher spending on this. If anything, in fact, the spending shares are slightly lower on those categories. We've also looked at whether they're less able to smooth consumption later on. So is there, for example, a fall in food consumption smoothing in the following months? And we haven't found any of that. So our sense is that these cards 2 and 3 boost demand in the short run. So that could have a good macro externality depending on the situation. And this is not at the cost of any micro negative externality. So this concludes the first part of the results, where we were showing the result by card type and overall. If at this stage you don't have any particular question, then I will keep going and move to the analysis of household characteristics, so the heterogeneity in the marginal propensity to consume. So the first thing we do is to look at 3 very standard sources of potential heterogeneity in the marginal propensity to consume. So depending on your level of liquid wealth, you might have a different MPC. So we measure this using the standard current account and liquid savings accounts for the French population. We also look at whether MPC is different by average income in the 3 months prior to the experiment, or by average weekly expenditure over the past year, which we take as our proxy for permanent income. And we're going to then show you that by quartiles of these variables, show if the MPC varies. So I'll do that, in sort of 3 separate regressions for cash on hand, for income, for past consumption. You can also put everything in the same regression, and the comparison of point estimates are very, very similar. So this is the result by liquid wealth. So the dot called Q1 is the less liquid household. This is the black dot, and the most liquid households is the triangle, the yellow triangle. And so you see in general that this is showing you the cumulative response, and the least liquid households tend to be slightly higher. It's not a super striking pattern, but they are indeed higher. Another thing that's informative here is actually to focus on households who are liquid. So one simple thing to do here is, well, let's take households who have at least twice their monthly income in liquid wealth. And there we do see that these households still have a very large MPC. So again, this is quite different from our main macro models, where the MPC response is really loaded on the illiquid households. Here you have a large number of people, very liquid, and they still have these large MPCs. This is looking at all the cards together. Now, by income, we actually see slightly, considerably larger differences. So Q1, the poorest households, and so they have larger MPCs, and in particular, if you accumulate the responses, the differences become bigger and bigger. Q1 is at an over 200 euro cumulative response after 3 months, while the other ones are actually now much closer to 0. So income here is an important predictor of a large MPC, and the pattern is even more striking when you look at past consumption as a proxy for people's permanent income. So again, the Q1, less rich, have this much higher MPC both at the beginning and then as you go forward in time, when the other ones tend to fall back down, especially the richest ones. There's other types of heterogeneity that you might wonder about. So we looked at gender, we looked at age, and I've previewed that gender turns out to be very big. So here the male recipients of the card are shown, cumulative MPC is shown in red and triangles, and female recipients are the black dots. So you see from the get-go, the males have larger MPC and then they stabilize, while for female respondents, you have this gradual fall back down. At the beginning, it is smaller. And in a way, this is consistent with evidence from the microcredit literature, where women tend to have a more cautious way of handling money, and if anything, are closer to the rational agent, who would smooth more, and which indeed is what they do here. And so that's interesting, especially given the the structural change in the share of income going to women over time. So we thought that was a surprising fact, and we see this when we look at single households, so where there is no question of mixed genders, but we also see that when we look at households with mixed genders, but where the person who receives the card is male or female. So this pattern exists in both kinds of situations. By age, the patterns are less clear. So if anything, older households may have larger MPCs, but our sense is that this data is quite noisy, and so we don't make too much of that here. So far, the main takeaways are large MPCs considered in the short run, much larger for the cards that have restrictions, and larger for women, larger for low-income groups, and still large for people with high liquid wealth. The last thing we want to do before we, again, bring things together to think about takeaways for policy and models is to think more broadly about heterogeneity in marginal propensities to consume, not just tied to observables. This is important because it's quite informative, for example, for the kinds of models you may want to write. So some models have lots of agents with very large MPCs, and then lots of other agents like close to zero MPCs. And other types of model might be a much smoother distribution of MPCs. So to make progress on that, let me first describe what the challenge is. So the regressions we've run so far, right, have period fixed effects. So those are necessary because spending varies from by period to period. We also have household fixed effects. That's not necessary because we randomize treatment, but that helps reduce noise. So we take out these fixed effects, and then we have sort of a residual. And this residual has two components, the error term and the treatment effect. And so really we observe two distributions. In the control group, we directly observe the distribution of error terms. They call them epsilon. In the treatment group, we have a convolution of two distributions, the error term epsilon and the household specific treatment effect called tau. This is the person specific marginal propensity to consume. And so if you don't make any additional identifying assumption, you can only get the average treatment effect tau, because you see the mean of the two distributions and the difference is the average tau. But you don't know the distribution of MPCs. Even though you have an experiment, you cannot identify the distribution of treatment effects. So maybe that's clear to everyone, but maybe to some people it's not clear. So one example to understand the issue is that if you see the data, and while the distribution of taus, so the full distribution of the treatment effect, it depends on the correlation between the error term and the heterogeneity in the treatment effect across households. And that, in principle, should be unrestricted. You need to make additional assumptions to restrict that. A concrete example of that would be something like where in France in May, people sometimes go on weekends because there's some public holidays. And so it could be that rich households do that more often and then have more spending at the particular point in time. So they would have a larger epsilon in those periods above and beyond the period effect because they spend relatively more than the less rich households. And then if you think that these rich households also have lower MPCs, say, then you have a negative correlation between epsilon and tau. And so this is going to be influencing your distribution of MPCs if you make another assumption that says, oh, this is uncorrelated or positively correlated. So if you have questions, I think, about the problem, that now is a good time to ask. Otherwise, I'll just tell you what we do to get past that. So the first thing we do is actually to assume away the problem, and then we'll try to test whether that's actually a reasonable assumption to make. So we're going to assume away the problem by saying, oh, let's assume that tau and epsilon are just independent. And if you make that assumption, maybe it's a strong assumption, we'll see in a minute, but it's certainly a powerful assumption because then we can recover the full distribution of MPCs without any parametric assumption, neither on the epsilons or on the taus. And so the reason is that we know through the experiment, we know that the distribution of epsilons is the same in the treatment group and in the control group. And now we said, oh, we assume that also it's independent of tau. And so we can then implement a deconvolution procedure to recover the taus given the observed data for the treatment group. So intuitively, the way this works is that you draw, you know epsilon from the control group. And so then you bring it to the treatment group, and then you draw a distribution tau, it's unrestricted, and you combine it with the epsilon at random, because we said it's an independent distribution, and you see whether that matches the observed distribution of outcomes in the treatment group. And so you do that many times until you found the proper distribution of taus. And then you might say, well, it's maybe not so plausible that tau and epsilon are independent. In fact, I gave you some example with vacation in May where maybe there's a negative correlation. So to make progress on this, we're going to implement a simple test. This is in the spirit of Emily Oster's work and also Joel Altangia's work like this, where the idea is to add observables and see if it changes your results. And if your results are very sensitive to the inclusion of observables, you might be concerned. So they do this in an OLS setting, and they have formal bounds. And here we're going to do that more informally, but it's the same logic. So the logic is we're going to repeat the analysis now with observable predictors for the MPC heterogeneity. So we know that MPC varies by age, by income, by gender, by liquid wealth. I showed you this before. And so if the epsilons are also different by these covariates, then I will see that in the data. And we in fact don't see that, and our results are very similar whether or not we include these extra controls. And so that means that for our results to be biased, the unobservable predictors of MPC heterogeneity tau should be much more strongly correlated with the unobserved shock epsilons than the observable predictors that we do see. And maybe it's possible, but for example, the story I gave you with income, that we can rule out because we do see income, it's observed, and that's not a problem. So that's the approach we took. Again, feel free to ask questions about the approach or the question or the issues that we try to solve. So if you don't have questions, I'll keep going and show you what we get out of that. So we get a full distribution of MPCs. And so here we report the MPCs by quantiles. So this is the median household has an MPC of 25%. And then you have 25% of households who have MPCs below 16%, or you also have 25% at the top who have MPCs above 34%. And this is for card 1 alone. We have quite a few who have low MPCs, but they're still not zero. It's still not permanent income. And at the top, you have a lot that have much larger MPCs. But overall, it's quite widespread. For card 2, the one with the expiry date, the story is quite similar, but it's all shifted up. So the median person now has an MPC of 53%, and it varies between 30% at the very bottom to 76% at the very top. Card 3 with the negative rates is somewhere in the middle. And so when we put all three together, then we get this shape here. And so that's, again, informative because it tells us that the heterogeneity we find between these cards is not driven by a small number of households. It's a broad-based difference across cards. So that leaves us time now to bring things together and think about the interpretation of this set of results. So first, I want to reiterate what I said about comparing to the benchmark model. So you take standard calibration of Hank models. The idea is that households deviate from an income because they have borrowing constraints, and so they're going to engage in precautionary savings, and they're going to then spend the extra transitory income I give them when they hit the borrowing constraint. And so when you calibrate the parameters of the Hank model to match moments of the liquid wealth, illiquid wealth distribution, as well as income processes, which is what this literature does, then you predict that the quarterly MPC should be 16%, and the annual MPC should be 41%. So this is done in the work of Kaplan and Violante, also in the Hank 2018 paper with Ben Bowell. Those are the numbers that are used. So that's certainly very different from what we observe in the data, where the estimated monthly MPC is is actually higher. It's not 16, it's closer to 22%, but it's also just in the first month. Really much more front-loaded and then all flat. While they have a much longer lived shock because people hit their borrowing constraint over time. And more broadly, the household behavior we observed between card one and the other types of cards reject standard models that treat money as fungible. That's what I mentioned earlier. Like if you only look at transactions under 300 euros, we have 88% of households in group 2 in our sample who spent at least 300 euros on their main bank accounts before the expiry date of card 2. So there they would have faced absolutely no constraint in using the card we gave them to cover these expenses that they made. But they did not act this way. They did not treat things as perfectly fungible, even though it was just costless for them to substitute current account spending for prepaid card spending.
Question, please.
Yeah.
So on card one, you said that after half a year, they get just the money as fungible, right? So it's just available for consumption or for savings, by the way, on the bank account. Yeah. So you can think about it as type of saving, maybe, and maybe a more rational behavior.
So card one, they will indeed get it in 6 months. What we see is that they still spend 20% of it in the 22% in the first month. So they're not permanent income savers. For sure, they deviate from that. And here, what I want to highlight is that card 2 and 3. Here, these guys don't treat money as fungible because they could just, especially card 2, right? They could just substitute without constraints. For card 1, I'm not saying anything about fungibility. I'm just comparing card 1 versus cards 2 and 3. I don't know if that gets at your question.
Yes, thank you.
And another one,
we also
please.
have a question. Okay, yeah.
If money is not fungible, so is it really MPC or just MPC, gift card MPC, not really money MPC? It's not the same thing.
Yeah, I agree. So here, card 1, we think you can think of as money MPC because eventually it's going to join your main account. And cards 2 and 3, you can say it's an MPC out of this particular mode of delivery of the transfer. I would be sympathetic to that. But I think that, you shouldn't say, oh, it's a very peculiar experiment because, in fact, countries have used this type of thing at a very large scale, especially in Asia. And here we have reasons to think that actually it's a very powerful way of promoting demand. But I agree that as soon as you go behavioral, then there's not a single, we knew before that there's not a single MPC. Right? MPC out of permanent income shock is different from MPC out of transitory income shock. But here this is MPC out of different ways of giving you the transitory income.
Yeah, thanks. And another one, is it tax exempt?
It is tax exempt, yes.
Okay.
So that's, there's something that seems to be go against the standard rational model. So we can think then about behavioral models. And often the papers in this tradition in macro have thought about present bias models. People wrote models like spender-saver models, where you have two very different types of agents, those who spend everything, those who are permanent income savers. Or you can write a hyperbolic discounting model where people have this beta delta preferences and then spend much more at the very beginning. So what's interesting here is that this type of model cannot account for the MPC difference between card 1 and cards 2 and 3. Because if you're beta delta, you will also be the beta delta in 2 and 3, and the beta delta treats money as fungible. His source of behavioral bias is not about fungibility. But there's another line of behavioral model organized around salience, where that gives rise to different types of behaviors like mental accounting, and that can then give rise to non-fungibility of money, and that's consistent with earlier work like what Jesse Shapiro and Justin Hastings have done when they studied food stamps. So they showed that giving food vouchers to people in the United States increased spending on food, although in principle they should have treated that money as fungible. And so in that sense, it's consistent with other contexts. And there's this long line of work by André Schleifer on how salience is a widespread psychological phenomenon that affects economic choices. And so you might think that it's something that perhaps is here to stay. You know, we have no way of saying it here, but when we think about external validity, it's useful to think about whether the psychological phenomenon at play here is a relatively standard one. And our sense is that indeed it might be one. So this sort of brings things together and brings me to the conclusion. And I want to conclude by restating the 5 facts. So we have low MPC on the no restriction cash-like transfer, about 20%, 22% the first month. If you change the mode of delivery with cards that expire, then you can substantially increase the MPC. You can maybe triple it. In all cases, the consumption responses are concentrated early on. You have lots of heterogeneity in MPCs by observed household characteristics, so you can also use that to increase the MPC, but not as much as by changing the card type. And finally, you have large unconditional variation in MPCs not related to observables, and that's also informative about the type of model that you want to write. So this means that implementation design, household targeting matter for aggregate demand, and having behavioral features like salience also matters for macro models. If I finish on a slightly broader note, it's a setting where basically we found a way to stimulate demand, even though interest rates were very low at the time. And with our negative rate card, expiry date card, we have much larger MPC than standard fiscal stimulus. And we feel that we're willing to extrapolate from our estimates to similar settings because we have a representative population, and the estimates we got for the standard card are actually close to the estimates of the 2008 tax rebate you get in the US, where it's also really loaded in the first month. It's also on the order of 20% with the new diff and diff estimators. Our intervention was designed to be scalable to the macro level. Lots of people could get cards like this, or you could implement that through central bank digital currencies. Maybe you could do this with the help of the retail banks who could manage the central bank accounts. And it's interesting to note that lots of policies with prepaid cards or consumption vouchers have been implemented, especially in Asia. So Japan, Taiwan, Seoul, Hong Kong had this type of prepaid card, but Milan also did, California also did. So usually it's just a card like without an expiry date, but Hong Kong, for example, and Seoul had consumption vouchers that expired after 2 months. So that could be a really practical tool for macro policy. And then, of course, this brings up many other issues, inflation, how you fund these things. And none of this is the subject of today's papers, but that's other important issues to think about if we want to bring that closer to policy. So that's what I had for you today. I think we may have a couple more minutes for questions if you're interested.
Thank you very much, Xavier, for this excellent presentation and the paper. So please raise your hand if you have any question. I will start with my question, but it's maybe above or maybe the continuity of this paper. So during the COVID, I had this idea of creating a prepaid card with categories of consumption, specific categories of consumption. So you are playing more in with the timing, but I thought that we could play more with the category of consumption, such as, look, we have a card with 300 euro, 500, 1,500 with only for clothes, 50 for clothing, 50 for I don't know, credit reimbursement, and such thing like that. So do you think that such a categorization of spending could be also a solution of let's say COVID distress or stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting. We actually thought about doing something like that as well. So, for example, only allowing people to buy local goods because we can geo-identify things. In the end, we have just 1,000 people, so we couldn't have too many treatment arms. So we don't have direct evidence on your idea, but the mechanism that we highlight, right, this idea of salience, the fact that other people have found that food vouchers are not treated as fungible, all of that is consistent with your idea that if I gave a card with prepaid allocation to different types of spending, people might well be quite influenced by that. And so then for me, the main question would be to know exactly what we want to encourage, what kind of spending do we want to encourage in different types of crises. But that might be, I think that's a promising way to think about this. And so for central banks to do that is interesting, because central banks could do that in the scope of their mandate, while if we gave fiscal authority the power to do this, there might be lots of other considerations that would come into play.
Yes, that is exactly related to my second question. So, and this very interesting slide about monetary policy relevance. Don't you think that, so I think that such a process should be implemented by a fiscal authority. And don't you think that, look, we have a fiscal authority that is giving money at negative interest rates. We have a central bank with a positive interest rate or a zero interest rate. Don't you think that this could generate lack of credibility for one or the other institution, or, and more importantly, frictions between these two sides of the economy, the fiscal and monetary policy one?
I mean, I think that, you know, my sense is that this is actually good for the central bank to do for credibility reasons, to be able to do it, you know, when it matters, for the price stability mandate, or in some cases also for the employment mandate, instead of giving it to fiscal authorities who are going to be much more responsive to the electoral cycle and other political economy considerations. And so having the central bank do that, also having other tools that are as powerful during periods like today with high inflation, and ways to really reduce inflation, reduce aggregate demand is then another important topic. But I think giving this to the central bank, it's a bit like a QE directly for people. Instead of buying the government bonds, then we directly subsidize groups of people, and we have these constraints like expiry date to encourage fast spending, and that could be good, you know, given the lags of monetary policy to lower rates. And this takes much more time to materialize. So that would be my view at this stage. But I'd be curious to learn more from you about where you see the potential inconsistencies between the fiscal and monetary policy side.
Okay, thank you. So we will have maybe an additional discussion after this seminar. Very interesting. So if we have any additional question, please raise your hand. We have a question from Anil. Anil, please.
Yes, sir. So I am calling from India. I wanted to know whether, because you conducted this experiment in France, whether if we conduct same experiment like India, so India being a poor country, so whether we will get a good result, or what is your view?
I think it's worth doing, and I mean it's easy to run if you have the money. It's you know, very clear research design, so it's like very easy to do and then see if the results are different. But I would imagine the results would be could be quite similar, because like, you know, this type of psychological phenomenon is probably quite widespread. If you have these expiry dates, people spend more. Maybe the heterogeneity might be different because income ranges would be different. But I think you know, finding resources in other countries to analyze this more, maybe change certain aspects of the experiment, like bringing things that are specific to certain product categories, like Jonathan was saying, that would be very interesting.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes, I wanted to know that if like I don't have the resources, so the government has, in India, the government has brought in the zero bank accounts. So can we do some experiments on that regard?
You mean doing a quasi experiment based on bank rates? perhaps, I mean, this would require more thought, but maybe that's a good setting to do it. But that I would need to know more about the exact setting and available data.
Thank you very much, Anil, for your question. We have a question from Michael Gilman. Michael?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the interesting paper. So I was curious, do you see some long-term effects? It's a one-time payment, right?
Yeah.
So do you see some like longer-term effects, like longer than half a year? I don't know.
So what we for now we haven't looked at the data more than 3 months after the rebate. We should look at that. The reason why we haven't done that is just that we become underpowered statistically as so if you ran a simulation with given the variance of consumption and all the shocks that people get, I think after it could show that after 6 months it's quite hard to estimate any effect. So our interpretation of the data so far is that you had this extra burst of spending at the very beginning and then nothing happened, but it's not like they reduced the spending down the line. That's our best guess so far. But perhaps there's ways to empirically to get at this more directly.
Okay, I have a few ideas. Maybe I can shoot you.
Okay, great. That would be great. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for your question. Do we have any additional questions? Okay, so Xavier, thank you very much. I may have a lot of questions and very interesting experiment and paper and presentation. Thank you again, Xavier, for this presentation. And I hope to see you soon at the VIMM seminar. Wait, we have maybe one question from Nimrod? No?
No, thank you.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much, Xavier.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for the questions. And if you have other thoughts, I'd be very happy to keep the conversation going by email or otherwise. So thanks so much. And yeah, my email is online if you have any other thoughts or questions. Thank you very much for the invitation. Have a good rest of the day. Bye.
With pleasure, Xavier. Thank you very much. And we hope this seminar was useful for your paper.
Oh,
see you soon.